right, here we go. Welcome, everybody. It's 6 o'clock. It's the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society. We're presenting Avengers today with Sarah Penner and Thea Sutton. But before we start to describe what this presentation is going to be, I'd like to turn it over to our president of our chapter, Faith Justice, who will talk a little bit about who we are and what we do. So Faith, go ahead, take it away.
All right, thank you, Susan. And I would like to welcome everyone as well. We are doing our usual Zoom in the world of COVID, which we've been doing for the past year and a half. And we found it to be so successful that we're going to be doing more of it as we go along. We used to do live in-person presentations, but that limited us to how many people we could get into a small room in a library. And now we're reaching out and touching hundreds of people with our presentations, and we're going to be continuing with that. But we are an all-volunteer army, the New York City chapter. We have no dues, so we have any expenses, and they're very few. We kind of take care of ourselves. If people want to get in touch with the Historical Novel Society, the international organization, they're available online, and I highly recommend that you do get in touch with them. They have biannual conferences, which are absolutely wonderful. We had a North American conference just this past summer. There's an Australian conference coming up, and there will be a UK conference next year. But because we are an all-volunteer army, we do reach out and ask our membership to help us out occasionally with specific tasks. And some of the things we've got coming up that we'd love people to get in touch with us and help us out with is we're looking for some people who might have some graphics background to help us basically do our website design, do our flyers. But we're looking for someone who can help us do templates. So they wouldn't have to do it all. They would just help us design it, and then we would fill in the information as it comes. And anybody who would like to join our steering committee and help with programming and tech and the outreach, again, please get in touch with us, at our website. We'd be very happy to include people because many hands make light work. And then last, there's always the tech part. Susan, who's hosting our program tonight, has been a wonderful tech person these past 18 months, but we don't want it all to be on her shoulders. So we're looking for some other people who might like to learn how to do the behind the scenes Zoom stuff. And if you're at all interested, we can get you trained and we can put you into the rotation. One last thing is the last program of our year will be coming up in November. That will be Friday, November the 12th at 6 p.m. And we're trying something a little bit different. You'll notice that our guests tonight are from all over. We've got one from Canada and one from Florida. Our guests, authors for the next time are going to be in Portugal. So because of the time difference, they are going to be actually presenting their program in a local bookstore in Portugal, and they're going to be recording it. Then we're going to host the recording live. Our own Stephanie Cowell will be doing that. And we will have at least Julieta Rodriguez, and I hope the other lady, Stephanie Ray dos Santos, available for live Q&A afterwards. So again, a little bit of tech shuffling there. But the program in November on the 12th is going to be called The Century of Light and Dark, 18th Century Historical Fiction. It's going to feature Julieta Rodriguez, and she'll be talking about her book, Eleonora and Joseph, and Stephanie Renee dos Santos, who's going to be talking about her book, Cut from the Earth. So please, watch out. We'll be sending out more information on those programs, and I hope to see you then. So I'm going to turn it back over to Susan, and she can introduce our wonderful guests for the night, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Well, thank you, Faith. It was great to hearing about our next lineup. So first of all, could I just remind everybody to make sure that your mics are turned off as we start, and we'll see about turning them back on later in the program. You'll also see in the chat field, there are links to these two fabulous books, The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner and The Women of Blackmouth Street by Thea Sutton. So let's get started. I was so thrilled to find these two books, even though they're set 100 years apart in London. They both are wonderfully well-crafted books with women protagonists. Murder and mayhem figure predominantly in the plots of both these books, where women work behind the scenes to save women or give women the means to escape their horrendous lives. These are worlds of pubs, prostitutes, actresses, men singing in socialist clubs in the middle of the night, or women making midnight visits to procure poison to murder their family members. The first book, The Lost Apothecary, is set in 1791. The second book, The Women of Blackmouth Street, is set in 1891. And both of these novels address the idea of women trying to save women in a time when men ruled society. So we're going to start off with a little treat here. The first thing that we're going to do is we are going to have Sarah Penner read a little bit from The Lost Apothecary. I'm just going to set it up a little bit. This is a story about a female apothecary who secretly dispenses poisons to liberate women from the men who have wronged them, setting 3 lives across centuries on a dangerous collision course. Rule number 1, the poison must never be used to harm another woman. And rule number 2, the names of the murderer and her victim must be recorded in the apothecary's register. So Sarah, can you please read us a little bit from your fabulous book?
Yes, of course. And thank you so much, Susan, for that lovely introduction. Thank you for everybody who's tuning in tonight. I would be delighted to read just about 1.5 minutes of the very first chapter of my book. So as Susan so eloquently said, this takes place in 1791. And this chapter is told from the point of view of Nella, who is the apothecary, really the main character of the book. February 3rd, 1791. She would come at daybreak, the woman whose letter I held in my hands, the woman whose name I did not yet know. I knew neither her age nor where she lived. I did not know her rank in society, nor the dark things of which she dreamed when night fell. She could be a victim or a transgressor, a new wife or a vengeful widow, a nursemaid or a courtesan. But despite all that I did not know, I understood this. The woman knew exactly who she wanted dead. I lifted the blush-colored paper, illuminated by the dying flame of a single rushwick candle. I ran my fingers over the ink of her words, imagining what despair brought the woman to seek out someone like me, not just an apothecary, but a murderer, a master of disguise. Her request was simple and straightforward: for my mistress's husband with his breakfast, daybreak, 4th of February. At once, I drew to mind a middle-aged housemaid called to do the bidding of her mistress. And with an instinct perfected over the last 2 decades, I knew immediately the remedy most suited to this request: a chicken egg laced with nux vomica. The preparation would take mere minutes. The poison was within reach. But for a reason yet unknown to me, something about the letter left me unsettled. It was not the subtle woodsy odor of the parchment or the way the lower left corner curled forward slightly as though once damp with tears. Instead, the disquiet brewed inside of me, an intuitive understanding that something must be avoided.
Sorry, I was oohing. That was fabulous. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to introduce Thea Sutton, our author of The Women of Blackmouth Street, 1890s London. Strong-willed Georgiana Buchanan, gifted psychologist and heiress, is forced to find a serial killer or risk having a dark chapter of her past exposed in 1890s London. But when her young, high-profile patient unexpectedly commits suicide, Georgia leaves Boston under a cloud of guilt. Lured to London's notorious Bedlam Asylum, she is trapped by a vengeful detective and a dangerous anarchist who knows too much about her into tracking a serial killer of women in the city's East End. Thea, can you take it away?
First off, thank you so much, Susan, for the invitation and for your very kind introduction. And also kudos to the New York Historical Novel Society. I think it's wonderful that you take such an interest in historical fiction. And I'm sure we can talk about that a little later on in this discussion. about what makes it so fascinating for all of you and why you come together, I guess, on a regular basis to discuss all of the fascinating aspects of this genre. So I'll read from the first chapter, and I think this is probably a good introduction to Georgia Buchanan. She is an heiress, as Susan pointed out. She's also someone with a lot of secrets, and she has a strange vocation, and she's also inextricably bound to a trio of women with whom she shares a complicated history. So I'll start there. Chapter 1. Apologies for disturbing, ma'am. I'm afraid the matter can't wait. I bolted awake. Sunlight saturated the room through a dusty window, and for a moment I was back in Boston, far away from the gloom that usually gripped London and its environs. In the doorway stood the squared-off shape of a caretaker. His eyes, roomy and pale, leaked a rare sympathy. The drip of last night's cocaine lozenge lingered in the back of my throat, along with the sensation of a nail screwing itself into the back of my head. I'm sorry, what can't wait? I said. Impatience mixed with dread. My voice was thick from lack of sleep, my hands smoothing cobwebs of hair from my face. Ignoring the stiffness in my limbs, the pinch in my lower vertebra, I straightened in the spare wooden chair where I collapsed in the early hours of the morning. I recalled entering the gates of Bethlehem Royal Hospital late last evening, the fires that had broken out in the London docks, reddening the sky with angry welts. Running alongside Lambeth Road, Bedlam, as the asylum was known to me and my colleagues in America and Europe, consisted of a squat central block with two vulture-like wings comprising 3 stories on either side, the last place I wanted to be. I'd escaped Boston to leave my work behind, though perhaps escape was too strong a word. I was searching for a type of recalibration, a place of quiet, and far enough away from scandal. The summons to Bedlam was both unwelcome and unsettling. I was more than familiar with asylums, although I'd only had an abbreviated tour of Bedlam 1 year previously under the watchful eye and bulbous nose of Mr. Pond. I cast the caretaker a quick glance. Last evening, he'd needlessly pointed out that female patients occupied the west wing and males the east, before we headed off in a westward direction, finishing with a warren of wards and rooms located off the galleries, each one containing a single toilet, a sink, and cold bath. Endless corridors of mental ruin. It was rumored that it would be 5 hours or so to walk all the wards of Bethlehem Royal Hospital, and I'd done my best last night. The small library where I surrendered after my useless search was empty, except for rows of mildewing books, spines cracked and worn, exposed by the sepia filtering through a grimed window. Morel's Traité de Maladie Mentale, Pritchard's A Treatise on Insanity and Other Disorders Affecting the Mind, and Charcot's Les Névroses Traumatiques, the hallmarks of my profession. With a pronounced stoop, the caretaker stared at me. He executed a series of meaningless steps, one back and one forward on the threshold, each annoying in its own way. I recalled the handful of silver readily received had made my unsanctioned visit last evening possible, and that the keys on Pond's belt opening the locks on 24 ward doors. Ignoring his expectant gaze, I squinted across the room to the scarred desk where my reticule, and more significantly, the note I'd received 24 hours earlier at Roxbury Park, waited like a lesion that demanded an immediate excision. An anonymous summons that had lured me to Bedlam, its meaning obscured. An echo of my failure back in Boston, or something else entirely. Another woman soon will die unless Georgia Buchanan arrives in time. Bedlam, September 7th, 1891. The words repeated in my head.
That's great, Thea. Thank you so much. What a wonderfully creepy intro to these environments. Well, I guess the first question I would like to start with is, Sarah, can you tell us that you picked this timeline in 1790 in Georgian London? Why did you pick this particular time to talk about an apothecary?
Yes, so there are a couple of reasons, and I love that this crowd can probably appreciate the first one. I think we all have eras and locations that naturally appeal to us. And for whatever reason, about 5 or 6 years ago, I just became enamored of Georgian London. And there are a few different reasons why. One of them is that it was pre-industrial revolution. So everything was really just done by hand. It kind of created this atmosphere of chaos. Brothels were all over the place. Georgian London is where we saw the gin craze. Fertility rates were down because of that. It was just a really intriguing era that you don't see as much in historical fiction. There's a lot of fiction surrounding the Tudor era, the Victorian era, which are all fascinating as well. But I've always kind of been the person, a little bit of a black sheep, in that I like to understand and read about and study things that other people are not. And so I became really interested in Georgian London. And when I started drafting The Lost Apothecary, that's immediately where my interests took me. And then I made this really serendipitous discovery as I was researching for the book in the very early phases. And what that discovery is that forensic science and the ability to detect poison in human tissue really did not exist until about the 1850s. So 1791, when the book was set, was a perfect time for an apothecary like the one in my story to get away with her sinister behavior and not really have the Inquisitions or bailiffs pick up on kind of what was happening. And what's interesting is the bills of mortality prior to the mid-19th century, you see almost no poisoning homicides listed in those records. And then all of a sudden, about 1850, you see tons of poisoning deaths. And it's because that was the time when they were finally able to detect it during autopsies. So it was this wonderful confluence of my own personal interests, but then also, factually, what kind of science permitted us to do. 1791 was a great era. And I was so worried at every turn, whether it was querying agents or trying to sell the novel. I was worried that the industry would push back and say, we don't have a lot in Georgian London. This is a very strange era. Like, we would prefer you post date it to Victorian era. But nobody did. I did not receive one request or under the breath comment that anyone in the industry wanted to later. So it's always been 1791, and I'm really proud of that. I liked it and it stuck.
Well, and genius that they can't track down the poison before then.
Right.
So that's fantastic. And Thea, what about you? Why did you pick Victorian London?
I chose 1890s because it really is the cusp of the modern age. It's the turn of the last century, and it really is a time of great social and political upheaval. It's very similar to our own in many ways on a number of levels. Firstly, it was called the Gilded Age, a time of great socioeconomic disparity. Apparently 10% of the population owned 3/4 of the country's wealth, the US's wealth, in the 1890s. Not so dissimilar to our period. There was great social unrest on the streets. There was interest in communism, Marxism, socialism, labor unions, and of course the suffragette movement. All of that is just, I found a very, very interesting mix, into which I, of course, threw Georgia Buchanan, who is very much representative of the second thing that is remarkable about the 1890s, and that is the rise of what was called the New Woman. And that was a phrase that was actually created by an Irish writer by the name of Sarah Grand to describe women who were becoming a little more autonomous in terms of control over their lives for a variety of reasons. Industrialization, opportunities for education, changes in divorce and inheritance law, which gave rise to a lot of opportunities to a certain class of woman. And at the same time, I also wanted to capture all the opportunities for exploitation during this period, because we have women, of course, who are working in factories, in domestic service, in sex work, etc., and who are also trapped in a certain kind of a box in similar ways that women who were trying to, who had a few more levers of power, who were trying to get out of the constraints that were keeping them in certain place. There's a lot of, I think, examples of women who were rising above their station, who were taking enormous risks in the 1890s. We have Ada Lovelace, who arguably is the first computer engineer. We have Florence Nightingale, who of course revolutionized nursing. We have Marie Curie, two-time Nobel Prize winner. We have Nellie Bly, probably the first investigative journalist who actually went undercover in an asylum to try and uncover some of the horrors that were going on in some of those institutions. And I wanted to imbue Georgia Buchanan with those sorts of strengths and weaknesses as well, to illustrate that strong women have always been out there and they've always left their mark on the world, whatever the era. And particularly in the 1890s, I think we had a lot of women moving to the forefront of trying to reclaim their lives.
I think it's so great you're saying this, because your character reminded me of a great combination of Sherlock Holmes and an Edith Wharton character. You know, so you have the science, but you also have the mores of what was happening at the time. So I think you really brought that to life. Sarah, I wanted to ask you a question about your protagonist. You have a timeline with a modern character named Catherine Parswell, and she's a historian. How did you come up with the idea of threading the idea of this apothecary in the 1790s with a contemporary woman from today? Were the two timelines always part of your plan?
Yes, when I initially drafted the story and kind of came up with the idea, I always had a present day timeline in there. And even just the title of the book, The Lost Apothecary, that was the original title that I thought of the very first day the idea came to me. The implication of something that's lost is that it can be found. And I knew that I wanted the apothecary to be so adept at her work, so good at disguising not only her shop, herself, her poisons, but so because of that, I wanted none of her contemporaries to ever find out about her. But someday, somehow, the secrets of the apothecary needed to be discovered for this to be a book and satisfying to the reader. So that immediately led me into the path of a present day character who in many ways is kind of like myself. You know, she loves London. She finds this clue while mudlarking. She starts sleuthing throughout the city. I tried to ask myself at every turn, if this were me, what would I do in this situation? You know, would I go to the British Library and look up this map or what have you? So I wanted to show the reader kind of how a modern day character would use her resources and tools to uncover a secret that was more than 200 years old. So for me, that it was always about two characters. I have had a lot of readers say that they definitely prefer the historical timeline. I think it's richer in sensory detail and a little bit more unique because we're talking about all of the poisons in this hidden shop. However, I think it's also been very fun for readers to discover those buried, unveiled secrets through the eyes of a woman who's present day kind of struggling with her own burdens and ends up kind of inconveniently intertwined in some things that don't necessarily reflect well on her either.
Well, I want to get back to your research in just a little bit because it's absolutely fascinating what you've come up with. But Thea, I did want to ask you about your character, Is it Georgia? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yes, Georgia. Yes.
You have her visiting these real institutions, the Bethlehem Royal Hospital and the British Museum, and there's a reference to a real newspaper, the Illustrated London News newspaper. But did you find in your research that there actually were anarchists in London at the time that were looking to topple the government?
Yes, that's actually historically accurate. At the time, because of the great economic disparities, there was much social unrest. Marxism was rearing its head, communism, socialism, the rise of labor unions as well, anarchists, and there was always this sort of feverish worry amongst particularly the government, as well as, of course, newspapers who were sleuthing all of this out, that these were the undercurrents that somehow had to be controlled or uncovered. So it's absolutely based in fact, yeah.
Fantastic. So Sarah, I just want to get back to you about your research. Did you actually go to London and go mudlarking along the Thames and the British Museum and all that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been to London many times, and I did have the opportunity to go mudlarking, but it was actually when the book was, we were in revisions with my agent. So we had not yet sold the book. It was actually just about 3 months before we sold it, but I was able still to incorporate some of that personal sensory detail into the manuscript before we went on submission. So I did go mudlarking. Anyone can go. You don't need to live in the UK. I highly recommend, if anyone's traveling to London, to get onto the Port of London Authority website and buy a permit. You do have to have a permit because they have plainclothes police that will fine you pretty steep if you don't have it on you. But it was so much fun. There are so many interesting artifacts, and there are a lot of mudlarkers on social media who find really interesting things every day, very enviable things that they then get to keep. And lots of mudlarkers have found apothecary vials. I was not so lucky. I found a lot of clay pipes and a ton of pottery fragments, but no apothecary vials. So I did go mudlarking. I've been to the British Library many times, where a couple of scenes in the book take place. The maps that are referenced throughout the story, I have on my computer. I have a hard copy version. I have like London maps all over my house. So definitely I was kind of relaying the present day character's experience through things that I have definitely done myself.
And did you happen to find someone like Gaynor?
Gaynor, the wonderful librarian who is so helpful to Caroline as she's doing her sleuthing, is really representative of a lot of very helpful researchers and archivists and librarians that I've encountered over my life. And I named her in honor of a really enthusiastic early reader who just loved the first chapter so much. This was long before I even had an agent. And she was so supportive and encouraging. So I named Gaynor in her honor, but Gaynor is just an all good character through and through. And a lot of people who've read the book really love her friendship and kind of what she does for basically a stranger. So she's a really wonderful representative of just good people.
Yeah, delightful, and not only an original name, but really an original character. The contrast was fantastic. So Thea, I wanted to ask you, in terms of your research, did you go to London too and map out? You have such great adventures when your character is actually walking someplace. Did you actually map out these treks that she was making?
I did, and I should say, as a preface to that, how I came across Georgia Buchanan. The first time I was in London, and my husband was attending a meeting at a hospital, an older hospital, I won't say which, in London, and I was waiting for him. And I was thinking, what can I do for the next 15, 20 minutes? And off to the side in one of these hallways was sort of an historical review of the history of the hospital, et cetera, and some of the doctors that work there and patients. So a lot of photographs and memorabilia and manuscripts and whatnot. And one photograph kind of snagged my attention. It was of a woman from behind, and she's going up a flight of stairs. And it was of the era, like maybe 1890s, and I could only see her in profile. So I really didn't know what her face looked like, but it was just something that stayed with me. A year later, I'm in Vienna, and I decided to tour Sigmund Freud's private residence, which is now a museum. The Freud Foundation has taken it over, but it was his residence, and in that apartment, he saw patients. So the foundation has recreated his offices where he was a therapist, and he actually pursued the science of psychoanalysis. After touring that apartment area, again, I went off to the side where there was a collection again of writings and memorabilia and photographs. Again, I saw this photo and I thought, is this possible? It was, to my mind's eye, the same woman I'd seen in London, walking up a stairway, just in profile. So at this point, I thought, well, there's got to be a message in this. And I became sort of obsessed with her. And I should say, in order to write, and I'm sure Sarah would concur, in order to write 90,000 or 100,000 words, you've got to be obsessed. So you're either obsessed with an idea or a character or a mystery. And so this photograph became my obsession. And I wondered who this woman was, the set of her shoulders, the tilt of her chin. There was something about her, and I thought, where's she going out in the world? And that's where that started.
Oh, that's a fantastic story. She was stalking you.
That's a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
So, Sarah, so I just have to ask you, all your research into poison and poison recipes were fabulous. How did you track those down?
Yeah, so the poisons themselves, there was a few different resources. There are a number of digitized pharmacopoeias, which is essentially like a medical directory or a directory of herbs and drugs. There are so many digitized pharmacopoeias from the 16th century through the 20th century that are out available online. And I am constantly singing the praises of these wonderful archivists who go and digitize and scan this material in page by page. Sometimes there's thousands of them. So a lot of those are available online. So I was able to narrow and kind of go into what type of pharmacopoeias or manuscripts, documents would an apothecary in the 18th century have actually had in her shop, and kind of extract some of the more commonly used herbal remedies and toxins from that. I also researched a number of real life poisoning cases from the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly in England and Wales. So I was able to see, these dinner parties where truly these servants or these wives or these mothers, how they would actually dispense of the poison and kind of the fallout legally from that. And what they were charged with. I mean, most of these accused poisoners were executed. So I tried to kind of augment some of my research with these real life cases as well. But when we talk about the actual recipes and the ways that Nella, the apothecary in my book, dispenses the poisons, I would say that almost all of them are just my own imagination. So the very first thing we see is she's putting Nux vomica into an egg. That was just my imagination. I thought, well, if I wanted to disguise a poison and someone was going to have it with breakfast, like what would be a good way to disguise it? And so I thought, well, I would poke a little hole in the egg and put the poison in and then cover the egg with a wax. And so that's what she does. There's another poison later in the book known as wolfsbane. And from my research, I learned that it's very, for people who have tasted it, it's very spicy, very pungent. And wolfsbane is also a root. And so I thought, well, if I were an apothecary disguising poison, I would make a horseradish sauce and put the poison in the horseradish. So that's what she does. So I tried to just get creative and take these factual bits of information that I learned and then just use my imagination and kind of put myself in the role of poisoner and ask myself how I would best disguise it.
So you could actually go back through your personal history and say, if I could get rid of somebody, here's how I'd poison them.
Yes. Oh, yes. I always said, if the CIA got a hold of my internet history, it'd be concerning. Now it wouldn't, because they know why I was doing this research. But it is, it's also kind of a personal interest of mine, to like a little home apothecary, not poison, obviously, but I like essential oils. I love teas. I like candles. And so it was fun for me. It did not feel like work to go and research all of these cool herbal remedies and toxins. It actually was really fascinating and kind of aligned with my own personal interests.
Yeah, I don't want to give too much away. I mean, it's always hard. I get so excited about these books, but there's plot points that I want to keep for the reader to discover. But you're talking about wolfsbane, I love the index in the back, who advised that when you shred these root fibers, that it is excellent when supper courses are served individually and to avoid buffets.
Yes, avoid buffets for sure, because then you're going to kill everyone.
I thought I love the index. I had to read that several times and got a nice hoot out of that. So Thea, I just have to ask, and your protagonist, did you actually find that there were women at that time who were called alienists? And were they modern day psychologists? Is that what they would be determined today?
In terms of my research, no, I did not find a female alienist. I was, though, fascinated by Caleb Carr's The Alienist, which was published in the 1990s. And I always did think, gee, wouldn't it be interesting if the alienist this time could be a woman? I think that probably Georgia, she represents, as you say, kind of she's a prototypical Henry James portrait of a lady heroine, in that she does have the ability to go out into the world, given her relationship with her father and her wealth, etc. But she's also has the freedom to pursue her interests. So the idea of someone who is particularly concerned with women's position in the world might find herself fascinated with madness, because my book begins with the line hysteria. Of course, at that point, the idea of madness, there was a physiological, biological connection to the idea of mental illness. And women, of course, because of their makeup, their biological makeup, it was thought that they were more prone to mental illness than men. And I thought it might be very interesting to insert a woman into that mix, into that group.
And she's so modern. When she's smoking cigarettes, she's taking cocaine lozenges, she's traveling on her own.
Yes, that was very much the prototypical new woman. The women in history that I noted earlier, in that regard, I mean, she's not unusual in any way. I mean, she's not representative of every woman, but she's certainly representative of the new woman. At the time, and you might recall as historians, you would see, a woman on a bicycle and bloomers and magazine covers, etc. That was very much the sort of metaphor for this woman going out into the world. There were a lot of opportunities for education too, particularly for women of wealth. There were women's academies that were teaching all sorts of things. So yeah, she's not unusual in that way. I just thought, though, that nexus, that connection between madness and the idea of women often being labeled insane when they weren't compliant in the way society required them to be compliant. I thought it would be very interesting to have a protagonist with a kind of curiosity and courage and intellect as a Georgia Buchanan to go wading into that world.
And she's also so aware of drugs, when she's talking about the tincture of opium and how it's used in some very exciting scenes, what drugs were used against women instead of for women. I mean, it's just such an interesting juxtaposition, her world of drugs as opposed to Sarah's world in The Lost Apothecary.
Well, it's funny, I get that question all the time about the cocaine lozenges and whatnot. And I should say, first off, cocaine was considered an analgesic, much like aspirin. They also used it literally as anesthetic during surgery. Freud used it on a regular basis. So the fact that Georgia uses it is not particularly unusual. Secondly, morphine, it was called laudanum. Women were dosed with it regularly because of their so-called nerves. If they were getting a little too upset or angry, etc., they would often be prescribed laudanum to calm them down. I also mention in the novel children, they would be given Mrs. Bailey's syrup, which was also a tincture of opium. If a child was fretful or wouldn't go to sleep, you dose them with a little bit of that syrup. So a lot of those habits, shall we say, were not considered sort of in the same light as we would consider them today.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's homeopathy in its most extreme use of the word. Sarah, I wanted to ask you, you write about a character who becomes the sole inheritor of a magic bookshop. Were women apothecaries? I would assume that they would have to know how to read and write. Was that a typical thing at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was, I wouldn't say typical or common. That's one, it's funny, there are so many different little things throughout, I think not just The Lost Apothecary, but any book that at a certain point, the book is fiction. And so in my books, because there are often so many manuscripts and clues, whether the characters are reading them or writing them, literacy it kind of has to exist for the characters in my book. So all of the women in The Lost Apothecary can read, can write. Now, the character you're referring to, that's Eliza, she's 12 years old. She has a unique ability, very good penmanship, and this becomes clear in the first couple of chapters, because she has been working to help her mistress compose her letters. Her mistress has kind of an essential tremor in her hand and can no longer write her letters. This mistress teaches Eliza really good penmanship and kind of some of those literacy skills that, being a young girl from the country, she didn't come to London with already.
And Thea, I wanted to ask you, I mean, your scenes of the original Bedlam Hospital are so horrific. Was this actually the situation at the time of how the mentally ill were treated?
Yes, in a very succinct answer, yes. People who had more money would, and again, a husband could send his wife to an asylum, an institution, on the flimsiest of pretexts. So the whole idea of compliance, I mean that literally. So someone of means might be able to send or choose to send someone to a private asylum where maybe the conditions were a bit better. And there were a lot of private asylums. They might have been called sanatorium, that might be another term, but it's where often women were sent because of some supposed mental affliction. In terms of Bedlam, it was established in the 1200s, went through a couple of iterations. It was torn down and then relocated, I believe, in the early 1800s. So if you want to go and see the building that Georgia spends some time in, you can now go to the Imperial War Museum off Lambeth Road. So essentially when Bedlam was not decommissioned, but it was moved to an outer borough of London, the building was decommissioned and it's now a museum.
Oh.
So yes, the conditions were certainly not the best. The treatments too, I mean, a friend of mine is a psychiatrist in Ireland, and I asked him, you know, what he thought of all of this, and he said, you know, sometimes, Thea, I think we haven't come very far at all. Mm. So we keep going in circles when it comes to how we treat madness. And remember too, Georgia is on that cusp again of the old ways of looking at mental illness as something that is physiological and biological and inherited, to studying with her mentor, William James, who is really the first psychologist he is a forerunner to Freud, to Jung. He's the man who put a lot of these questions and this research in place, looking at mental illness beyond just from a physiological standpoint, but investigating areas around psychotherapy and also certain social and economic fundamentals that also contribute to well-being and to mental health. So she is exploring the old way, the old approach to these topics and these subjects, and she's also intrigued by some new research into that area. And of course, what she finds out through the course of her investigations, and I hope what the reader discovers too, is that sometimes it's reality that will basically make you embrace insanity, and that sometimes people do monstrous things, but for all the right reasons.
Yes, very well put. Sarah, I wanted to ask you, I think the idea of your register in the book is so wonderful. And your sayings, rule number 1, the poison must never be used to harm another woman. And rule number 2, the names of the murderer and her victim must always be recorded in the register. The register is such a magical tool. How was this always part of your idea about what the through line of this story was?
Well, so for anyone who's not read the book, what Susan's referring to is the Apothecary's Register, which is this really big book where she writes down every poison she dispenses, the date, the person who purchased the poison, and then the intended victim. And the register serves a few different purposes, one of which is it helped me provide some character background and motivation for Nella the apothecary. We talk about why it's important to her to preserve the names of these women who history would otherwise forget. It's something she holds very close. So it kind of served that purpose. Also, I mentioned earlier, because it's dual timeline, something needed to be lost that was not discovered for 200 years. The register is really that thing that we see. The present day character, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but she is able to gather some clues from that handwritten register that help her solve the story. And then also the stakes. That's the number one thing. I mean, this book has the names of all of these women who've bought poison. They're essentially killers and criminals. And so it creates a lot of stakes around this one book. And the apothecary has a really tough decision at the end of the story. What do I do with this book that has all of this incriminating detail in it and all of these answers and things that have been happening for many, many years? So the register provided a lot of different things for the story. And then, I just love old manuscripts also. So the few times I've been to the British Library, I always go to the rare book room. I can't believe they let people like me or any of us request these manuscripts and documents that are hundreds of years old. I mean, they almost are crumbling under your fingers. So I'm just obsessed with old documents, and it's so enchanting to me that people hundreds of years ago touched these same pages. I mean, that's why we all love history. So I love, the book I'm working on now has some old documents in it as well. I just can't avoid it. I don't think I could write a story without some sort of old log of some kind.
That's great. Hey, I just wanted to bring up all these wonderful quotes and little, ominous messages that come. But one of the things that really took me was your choice of Voltaire's quote of "Every man is guilty of the good he did not do." What a brilliant quote that was. Did you find that early on to be part of this message to your protagonist about inciting her to do this trek?
Well, it came a little later in my writing of the manuscript, but I did what I referenced earlier about that sometimes people are capable of doing monstrous things for all the right reasons. That was the theme that I wanted to echo throughout the novel, throughout the book. And the Voltaire quote seemed particularly apt. that, we're sometimes guilty of the good that we don't do. So I just wanted to thread that theme throughout the novel.
Yeah,
And the whole idea is, of course, is that someone like Georgia Buchanan, I mean, she prides herself in knowing the human psyche. So that's her arrogance. And of course, she falls from that pedestal. She has her comeuppance because she realizes that it's a lot more complicated than she first thought. And the irony is that it's not right or wrong. It's not immoral or amoral or moral. Sometimes it's not black and white, but shades of gray.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Sarah, I just had to ask you, in your adventures in mudlarking, did you also go harvesting beetles by moonlight for poison?
No, I've never done that. And that a lot of that scene was imagined. I had to do some very strange research, like where do beetles live? Where, especially in the winter. And apparently they really do feed on starchy root crops. So that's where my characters go to harvest these poisonous beetles. But that was actually probably the most interesting toxin that I discovered in my research was these cantharides beetles. They're an aphrodisiac as well as very toxic. And they were used in Parisian brothels in the 17th century for these women to kind of seduce these men and then kill them. So that was definitely the most interesting poison, and it definitely plays a very important role in the book as well.
It was a brilliant scene. I don't want to give anything away, but I could feel the beetles on me for the next couple of days. So Thea, and you're such an interesting background for your character, that the father is this captain of industry in the United States and the mother seems to be missing. I'm just curious, will you be writing more stories with her as a protagonist and we find out more about her family background?
Yes, that's exactly the intent, right? That, I want this to be sort of a slow reveal. And I have heard from readers, many of whom would like to know more about Georgia and why she does what she does. Of course, she could be, an Edith Wharton character. She wouldn't have to spend her time with the mad and the bad. As she says at one point, diseased minds are my interest. So we're given to wonder why. Why did she take up this strange vocation? And why does she have this dark chapter? Because of course she's in London because she's had a failure in Boston with one of her patients. This is what really drives her to leave the country and to get away from that scandal. So yeah, there are a lot of unanswered questions, and I did that quite deliberately.
Excellent. I want to hear where her next city of this this happens. Sarah, the thing that was so wonderful about this quest of, women helping women, and there was a lot of issues about women having children. I thought it was very touching that it wasn't just the typical trope of women expected to have children, and that. Did you go into writing that book with that theme in mind, or did that reveal itself to you as you wrote?
I really did not. No, it kind of came about organically, particularly when I was musing on the fact that there's 3 characters in The Lost Apothecary, and they're all at vastly different phases of their life as it relates to childbearing. So we have a 12-year-old who is, as the book unfolds, going through her first signs of puberty. We have a woman who's very much in the child-bearing decision-making years of her life. And then we have our 3rd character, the apothecary, who's at the end of her life. She's very ill and knows that she cannot have children anymore. And so we're seeing each of these women reflect on what children do or do not mean to them. And particularly as it relates to the older character and the youngest character, there is a relationship between them that could also have a motherly aspect, depending on how you view it. So I think it made for an interesting musing and exploration, but I didn't go into the story with that intent. It kind of came about organically.
Yeah, I think it was wonderfully laid in because, crones are usually seen as not being that interested in a family unit. And you had maternal aspects of the crone, which I thought was really original and really wonderful. So I'm just going to ask real quick, Sarah, what are you working on now? Can you talk about what your next project is?
So yeah, I can kind of give some vague details because it hasn't been announced. But what I can say is that my next book that I'm working on will absolutely appeal to readers of The Lost Apothecary. It's not a sequel, it's a standalone. However, it's set in an atmospheric historical setting. It features brave, rebellious women, and there are lots of cliffhangers and twists and turns, much like, readers loved in The Lost Apothecary. So I think when people walk into a bookstore down the road, they will find the books similarly situated on the shelf, but they are two completely different stories.
Oh, the suspense is killing me. Okay. And Thea, what is your next project about?
I am finishing right now a manuscript that is the present day story. Yes, about two women, and it's sort of a Thelma and Louise reprise. But I haven't forgotten about Georgia Buchanan either. I am sort of under the gun to essentially provide the next chapter in her life. And I see her going to New York and Vienna. And Vienna, of course, a young Freud. So we'll see where that goes.
Oh, fantastic. Now we do have just a couple questions here. Diva wanted to know, we'll take you first, Sarah. What was your biggest research challenge and how did you overcome it?
Yeah, so I saw this question a few minutes ago. There are a variety of research challenges, but one that came to mind is the vernacular. I mean, when we talk about writing historical fiction, there are so many words that we use today in our everyday language that did not exist even 100 years ago, much less in 1791. And I really decided to take some creative liberties, and I like a range of vocabulary in my personal life. And then as I write, I just find interesting word choices. And I frequently realized a lot of these words that I prefer to use to describe something just didn't exist in 1791, and I just put them in anyways. So that was kind of a challenge because every time I did that, I would cringe a little bit, wondering, is some reviewer or critiquer going to come after me with this word choice someday? And particularly Eliza, she was 12 years old. She has a pretty mature voice. She uses some words that a 12-year-old might not really use. But I went with it anyways, and that's what you can do as the author. So, for as much as I've gotten feedback on The Lost Apothecary, I don't think there's any specific words that readers have come after me about. So clearly people, they aren't too worried about word choice from a historical perspective.
That's right. It's historical fiction, folks, fiction. And Thea, what about you? What was your biggest research challenge and how did you overcome it?
It probably had to do with the James family, William James and Alice James specifically. And, I hope they're not spinning in their graves. I tried to honor the people that they were, the way they're represented in their writings. Alice James was quite the avid diarist. William James, of course, his scholarly writings. So what I did is I probably put certain thoughts and actions to those historical characters that I don't think are necessarily sort of out of left field. I think, William James was capable of thinking and doing what he did in The Women of Blackmouth Street, offline, but in the novel. And I think Alice James as well. Without giving away too much, I do think that the personality that I discovered in the historical record, I think I was true to that. And as Sarah says, as the writer and a writer of fiction, you can take some license. So that was a challenge for me.
Excellent. So here's another question from Matt. Matt wanted to know, Sarah, we'll start with you. How much research did you start before you started writing it? And how much did you do actually while you were writing the manuscript?
Yes. So I would say I do about probably 60% of my research before writing a manuscript. So I'm trying to ground myself in the world. Just truly things like, how did people get around? What are they eating? What are people doing for work? What are family situations like? Where do people live until they're married? How many kids are most people having? So I kind of centered, and I mentioned at the very beginning of this call that I had an interest in really an obsession with George and London anyways. So a lot of that existing world building was already just kind of in my brain, but I did a lot of research on apothecaries, doctors, and kind of the medical field, from a historical sense. I did that before writing, but then once you actually start writing, I have a tactic that I think a lot of writers actually use. As I'm going through a scene, if I get snagged on something, maybe it's a type of wine that they might have been serving, or a specific toxin or poison that I needed that I didn't have readily available in my mind, rather than going back to my research material, which is very time consuming, I just do little brackets, and I will say like bracket wine. And then I can later, when I have a research day, I can just do the control find function in my document and have kind of go through them one by one. And so that takes a fair bit of time, but certainly you don't, if we have any aspiring writers on the call, I mean, you're not going to have every single research item you need. And it's very time intensive to index them. Really at a certain point, once you've got enough to just know what a scene looks like in your head kind of visually, go ahead and just start writing it and telling it, and you can fill in the rest of the details later.
That's great. And what about you, Thea? You had so many interesting real life people. Was that difficult for you to research? And Matt is asking, how much did you look up before and how much did you look up as you were writing?
Well, I think I've read a lot. I'm fairly familiar with the literature of that era. I have read a lot of Henry James. I have read a lot of Edith Wharton. So in a way, I probably had already assimilated a lot of the details and the atmosphere of the period. And I find atmosphere is really important. And I try before I start writing to immerse myself in that era so that I can capture, if not exactly all the details, because I don't think there are too many readers who are going to be, Googling and checking up on the absolute accuracy of every reference. But I definitely want to build that world so that the reader comes away with a feeling. So yeah, to answer your question, on the one hand, I already think that I'd assimilated a lot of that period. And then secondly, I wanted to make sure that I had captured it before I actually started to write. And then secondly, I had an idea of where I wanted this to take place. So then I did secondary research into areas of London that I hadn't explored previously, et cetera. And then I did do some research into the James family. I read a lot of William James's work as well as Alice James' diaries.
Fantastic. I think this has been such a great overview of what it's like to write a historical novel. You actually go to the libraries, you go and you put on the boots, you go into the River Thames and you dig around. But I did want to ask one last question of the two of you. We'll start with you, Sarah. Would you consider that you're, in terms of writing, oftentimes we say we're a pantser or we're an outliner. What would you say your technique is?
It's funny you should ask. The Lost Apothecary, I fairly well pantsed my way through it. I had the luxury of doing that because I didn't have an agent. I didn't have a deadline. I could just kind of do what I want. And then my next book, as tends to happen, I suddenly do have a deadline. And so I don't have the luxury of pantsing my way through it. So I'm now an outliner, and I actually have found that it's much more effective and efficient. So I've evolved, but down the road, when I write another book that maybe I'm not under such tight constraints, I would love to kind of go back to the pantsing maybe for a book or two, because it's kind of creative and fun in its own way.
That's great. And what about you, Teo? How would you consider, what would your style be?
Oh, definitely a pantster. Definitely a pantster. It's as Sarah says, it's more fun. you could go off piste, you know, you can just, you know, roam wherever you like, particularly when you're doing historical novels. But then comes the painful part. You know, being a pantser, sometimes you write yourself into a dead end, or you make work for yourself. So yeah, I mean, the pantser thing is fun, but same thing for, you know, the next iteration, it's going to be, I'm outlining.
Excellent. I mean, these are just such great viewpoints about what we learn and how to write. Well, we're going to wrap it up here. I have put the links to your books in the chat field so people can buy them. Sarah, I did want to say congratulations on your book being optioned for a series on Fox. And Thea, I'm really looking forward to what happens to her next. It's so nice to meet such a ballsy, take charge, kick-ass woman in Victoria, England. It's really fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm just going to let Faith say goodbye to us before we sign off. Faith, did you want to say anything before we go off into the night?
Yes, I wanted to particularly thank Thea and Sarah for giving us their time and their energy. It was a fascinating program to see your writing journey, and I'm sure it was interesting to all the folks who were listening in, and all the folks who will listen in, because this will be put up and we get like hundreds of people who watch the reviews. And I just want to take a real quick moment and thank all of our HNS NYC people who helped put this together, you know, particularly Susan for doing all the research, the reading, and a wonderful job moderating the panel, you know, and coming up with all your great and insightful questions. I wanted to thank Lisa, who does all our promotion. Actually, Susan also does a lot of our promotion on Facebook. Lisa does all of our email promotions and our website. And Loretta does membership outreach. So she actually calls people and talks to them about what's going on. And so we really appreciate all the hard work you lovely ladies did in putting this together. So again, thank you all participants who come and, you know, and spend time with us. I hope we see you in November. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so much,
you,
Sarah.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Right.
Good
It was
night.
wonderful.